All right, we have a jam-packed session, so we're going to get started so that we can get as much content as possible. My name is Bob Ray Bordelon. I am from Princeton University, and I am the Vice President-elect of IASSIST. Welcome to the session. This is the first of the regular sessions. Hopefully everyone's in the right room, but this is A3. It's part of the data literacy track. A couple of reminders. This is a hybrid conference. So if you're like me and normally you're in the back of the room and you say, I don't need a mic, you need a mic. Otherwise our remote participants cannot hear. So it's really important that when we get to the Q&A that there is a mic that will be going around, that you speak into it. Also, for our speakers, I've already reminded you 12 times in email, but if you're like me and you hate being at the podium, nope, stay at the podium. So, all right. So today we have 4 groups of speakers, and I also want to mention my colleague, Ophira, also from Princeton, is going to be our tech support. This is largely for the people outside of this room who are watching virtually, but if you have any questions, you can put into the Q&A, and Ophira will be looking at all of that. I'm excited that we have a truly international group of people from the US, from Canada, from Nigeria. So today, our first one is going to be Sophia, Lafferty-Hess, and Jen Darragh from Duke University. They're going to be talking about an evolving research data policy landscape, reflections on an academic library's place. So, Jen, as I mentioned, both of them are at Duke. In her role as Senior Research Data Management Consultant, she provides training and consulting services designed around the research data lifecycle, covering several general best practices as well as special topics and tools. She serves as a member of the team that supports their research data repository. Prior to joining Duke, she was the data and sociology librarian at Johns Hopkins, the social and behavioral sciences librarian at Virginia Commonwealth, and the data archivist at Penn State for population research. Throughout her career, she has gained particular expertise in the management and archiving of sensitive social, behavioral, and health sciences data. And then with her today is her colleague, Sophia. She has an MS in Information Science and an MPA. She currently works as a senior RDM consultant where she provides data management, instruction, and guidance on best practices for organizing, documenting, preserving, and publishing research data. She has supported the curation and archiving of research data for over a decade, and in her current role, she also helps manage the Duke depository. She is a curator within the Data Curation Network. Previously, she was at the Odom Institute. She is also an elected member of IASSIST, so she is serving as a member at large for the United States. Jen has also held leadership positions. So there are people like myself and Kevin and Ryan who have these Ask Me's, but I would say these are also good people you can ask me, at least about IASSIST. So I'm going to turn it over to them.
All right, thanks, Bob Ray. And for those of you online, I'm Jen, so Sophia will be next, so that way you can associate the face with the name. So as Bob Ray said, we're going to be talking about an evolving research data management policy landscape and where the libraries fit in that in an academic setting. So we've actually shared this before in a 2018 IASSIST conference presentation, but to recap and to share for those who haven't heard before, this is basically our origin story. In 2015, an NSF research proposal was rejected due to an insufficient data management plan, specifically that they didn't say anything about sharing data. As a result, several groups across campus, including the library, Central IT, and the College of Arts and Sciences collaborated, and they decided to create a faculty working group to investigate these issues. They worked across 9 months over the period of 2016 and put together a set of findings for the provost because the provost wanted a unified look at these things. The provost accepted the findings and agreed to fund the recommended resources that came about as part of this report, and that included 4 research data services positions which were filled in 2017. So this includes 2 research data management consultants, myself and Sophia, and 2 repository services analysts. And the thing about us is that we do have an academic and medical campus, and our mission is to provide services to both. The funding also allowed for the development of the Duke Research Data Repository and for the team to develop all associated policies and workflows associated with it. The Research Data Repository was launched in 2018, and we have seen steady growth over the years. And in mid to late 2022, we finally published our 200th data set. And if you're interested, it actually is on monkey vocalizations for a nearly extinct species. It's actually pretty cool. So what we do. The core services that we have offered include proactive education around data management and sharing, consultations and advice, lots of data management plan reviews, especially of late, and local data repository services. We feel libraries are a natural place for these services to be situated, given our long focus on the preservation of the information record over time, and the significant new focus on data literacy, curation, and management for library professionals, as well as within library and information science programs. So 2023, or as we call it, the year of Policy Palooza. The Biden administration actually will end up calling this, or they are calling it, the year of open science, which, of course, that's true, but it's also the year of anxious researchers trying to adapt to new workflows and processes. So the first federal level policy to go into effect in the United States this year was the updated data management and sharing policy for the National Institutes of Health. All research that generates scientific data are required to now include a data management and sharing plan. Naming an actual repository for where the data will be shared is an important element of this plan. Many Duke researchers seek NIH funding, so we knew that this was going to have a big impact on our services. In conjunction with the NIH policy, the Office of Science and Technology Policy released a new memo, commonly called the Nelson Memo. This was last fall, instructing all federal agencies to update their policies to advance open and equitable research, including sharing data. Again, this is resulting in that open science moniker for this year. So we're seeing an increased focus on making all forms of data more broadly available to the public. In local news, a cross-campus initiative was started in 2020 to create a unified research data policy at Duke, which, given the difference in stakeholders, again, we have both a medical and an academic campus, and all kinds of research, this was not easy by any means. The Duke Office of Research Initiatives led this, and they did their best to obtain perspectives of the people all across Duke, all kinds of stakeholders. People were engaged at every level, from faculty down to support staff. The timing coinciding with the NIH policy was actually really advantageous because some of the key research support stakeholders for the institution's policy are the same people who help support the NIH grants workflow. So, and actually our institutional research policy went into effect at the beginning of this month. Research data policy, I should say. So to briefly frame the topic at hand, where do academic libraries fit to help support these data policies? So we can look at a recent OCLC report that examined cross-campus partnerships within the university enterprise. They begin by stating a description by William B. Rouse that universities are complex adaptive systems with the following characteristics. So nonlinear dynamic behavior, independent agents, goals and behaviors that differ or conflict, intelligent and learning agents, self-organization, and non-single points of control. I'm not going to parse each of these, but I think for those of us in academia, it paints a familiar picture. University systems contain many independent actors, such as faculty. They're often relatively decentralized with a diffusion of authority and can be highly heterogeneous. I always say that word wrong. Heterogeneous? Did I say it right? Okay. Which may lead to conflicts and competition. And dare I say it, the reinvention of the wheel every so often. So within the context of developing and cultivating research data support services within these systems, we know that there are various units that are important stakeholders. And the OCLC report provides the conceptual model with 6 key stakeholders, including academic affairs, research administration, the library, information and communications technology, faculty affairs and governance, and communications. We're going to focus primarily on our experience working with research administration. So due to the often decentralized nature of institutions, as well as the complexity in the service unit landscape, collaboration and building partnerships, or what they refer to as social interoperability, becomes a key aspect of advancing data sharing and data services development. This is where our close work with the Duke Office of Scientific Integrity has been mutually beneficial in building services and covering researcher needs expeditiously and expansively. And I'm going to turn it over to Sophia to keep us going with what's been going on lately.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So now we're going to kind of transition, and I'm going to be sharing a little bit more about what we've been doing to support the NIH policy implementation specifically, and sharing some somewhat candid reflections on our work with the Office of Scientific Integrity, the library's place, our kind of positionality, as well as some of the institutional dynamics. So one of the things that we did, and this was led by our Office of Scientific Integrity and in collaboration with the Medical Center Library, was in November we provided what we called an NIH Policy Blitz Roadshow. So we went and actually visited 33 department unit meetings and provided a 20-minute presentation, and 10 asked for a recording instead. And so this is where having a big team to support this many presentations was really useful. So, candid reflection. I also think, though, that the power dynamics of actually having the Office of Scientific Integrity being the ones approaching the departments is probably one of the reasons that we had such a high response rate, because of some of those kind of institutional, weight that comes with it coming from them versus if I'd done a cold call within the libraries. We've also taken a multi-pronged approach to service requests and delivery. So we don't have like a one core intake process, and people can reach us in various different ways, including requesting a review via the DMP tool, emailing our units directly, or some actually just reach out to Jen and myself. We have some office hours, and then we also have some resources and ways to connect on a suite of tools called My Research Home and My Research Path. So My Research Home is pictured on the top. So this is essentially a dashboard or portal for researchers to manage their research projects as well as compliance pieces for that project. And we had you can't really see it, but a drop down where data management planning is one way that they can submit a request directly through this dashboard. And that actually goes to a REDCap form that's managed by Jen, myself, and our Office of Scientific Integrity, and we triage that together. And then we also collaborated on creating a data management and sharing policy page on what's called My Research Path. So this is a roadmap that's mapped to different stages of the research life cycle that provides Duke faculty with access to policies, processes, resources, and guidance to facilitate their research. And so again, people can understand information for how to get consultations and help on that portal. So again, a candid reflection here. This distributed approach of having like lots of ways that people can get to us is really helpful. But when we started to think about, people are asking for some centralized reporting on, how much support we're giving for data management and sharing, we found that we definitely had to do some data wrangling to combine those disparate data sources. So while that's great, it does complicate tracking and reporting. I'll also note, it's not really here, but we did decide we didn't make our own library data management and sharing guide page, and instead we decided to contribute to this centralized resource. We saw it as a nice way to continue to collaborate with our Office of Scientific Integrity and not kind of have multiple decentralized silos of the same information that we're having to update in multiple places, but instead we created linkages and kind of connections between these different resources. Okay, so on to the numbers. As I said, we have been working on doing some centralized reporting across our units. So these are the numbers from the first NIH cycle, which ran through the beginning of February. I should also note these statistics are only coming from Duke University Libraries and the Office of Scientific Integrity, so I am sure there are other units at Duke that are providing support. So our N, we saw for that first cycle 103 proposals submitted that should have had a data management and sharing plan. We did what we called 87 DMSP touches, so we reviewed 41 plans, provided 28 consults, we did 18 quick questions, which is essentially like sending information via email, sending our boilerplate language for our repository. Of these touches, 72% were actually provided by the library data management and consultants, so that's me and Jen, so we've been busy. And then this actually, when we compared this to our consulting from the previous year, shows around a 700% increase due to these NIH questions. So we've really been seeing exponential growth. Again, this was the first cycle. I'm sure people are going to learn. We're not sure what that scale is going to look like as we move forward. Okay, reflection. So again, it's really great to have this kind of centralized institutional reporting and understanding what's going on at a high level. For instance, this 103, this we wouldn't have this data within the libraries, right? We know this information because of our partnership with the Office of Scientific Integrity. But I think also as we move forward, we're really going to want to be thoughtful about making sure that the role of the libraries is visible in these numbers, right? So telling our own story, doing some of our own reporting, so essentially, we don't get lost in the data. Okay, so I'm going to end with just another few reflections when Jen and I took a step back and thought about our place here, the work we're doing. One thing we feel is that the library is pretty well positioned to be a facilitator and a partner with researchers to complete these data management and sharing plans, but we really don't want to be put in a position to be like the compliance police or certifiers or approvers of the quality of plan, and really think it's important that that responsibility is retained by the researchers and the PIs. We've also found, and the second one is a little bit more related to our work with our research data policy initiative locally at Duke, but when we were working with a lot of those stakeholders, we oftentimes found ourselves in a role of advocating for open scholarship, advocating for data sharing and what that looks like in practice with some people that maybe didn't have as much of a shared understanding about that. But we also found it was really important to approach kind of how we talked about data sharing with some caution and being really clear that we believe in data sharing, but we believe in it within an ethical and legal framework. So kind of that as open as possible, as closed as necessary. We don't want to be seen as like open data zealots. This other one, when we go around and talk to different groups, sadly, I do think there is still some folks that really see the libraries from a more traditional, old school view of we provide books and journals and things like that, and they maybe don't always recognize our role in the evolving aspect of data services. So I think we're going to want to continue to demonstrate our expertise in this space as we move forward and work with these different institutional partners. Okay, last two. And these are more, this first one's about money. So at Duke, we have taken an approach of our services are free to all, and we really believe in providing that equity in access. But the new NIH data management and sharing policy, specifically with their grant budgeting expectations, say, data management and curation is an allowable cost. And there's also conversations going on around, the institutional cost for supporting data management. So we feel that, there probably will be some more pressure from an institutional perspective to think about how we might monetize some of these services going forward. And I think we'll just have to be, again, strategic and thoughtful about how we talk to administration about what that might look like and what that means for our service profile. And then finally, obviously questions of scale. As Jen mentioned, the OSTP memo, more federal agencies are going to be putting out these new policies. And I do want to acknowledge, though, Jen said, we have a lot more staff, we have more privilege in Duke with the resources that we already have compared to other institutions, and we're already sort of worried about scalability. So I think some of this also relates to when we think about our place in the library, how are we talking to administrators about what we can do in a reasonable fashion with the resources that are available, and then how do we try to position ourselves to advocate for additional resources if they really want us to be providing certain services. Okay, so thank you for your attention. Again, we're happy to take questions during the Q&A, and I'm really interested in also hearing from others that might work in academia or library land, if any of this resonated with you or other kind of things that you have experienced. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen and Sophia. We are going over to, oh, you have a new one? Okay, let me just unplug this one, plug this one in. All right, so while we're plugging things, next up, there are 4 co-authors, but we're going to have 2 speaking today, and we're going to be talking about data literacy lessons from a mini course on data inclusivity and accessibility. And so with us today are Christine Nieman, University of Maryland, Baltimore, and Elizabeth Roth, Medical University of South Carolina. So Christine is the data management librarian for Region 1 of the network of the National Library of Medicine at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. She supports and provides regional and national education and outreach programs focused on data literacy, research data management, and other data-related topics. And then Elizabeth, next to her, serves as the research and data science strategist for Region 2 of the network I just said, headquartered at the Medical University of South Carolina. And she has over a decade of experience managing the activities of public and private health grants. And she's passionate about health equity, health humanities, and improving health literacy through libraries.
Thank you for that introduction. And we are speaking today about a short course that we developed and hosted this past spring on inclusivity and accessibility in the data age. There we go. So just before we dive in too much, I want to provide a little bit of context on who we are and how this project came to be. And I'm going to start by telling you about the organization that we work for. And there's a handy graphic to help explain as well. The National Institutes of Health, the NIH, is the United States' leading medical research agency comprised of 27 institutes and centers, and the National Library of Medicine is one of these institutes. The NLM, National Library of Medicine, is the world's largest biomedical library, which maintains and makes available a vast print collection and produces electronic information resources such as Medline Plus and PubMed. We are coming to you today from the NNLM, which is the network of the National Library of Medicine. We are the education and outreach arm of the NLM. We support the NLM's initiatives and services by offering free trainings and grant opportunities to librarians, information professionals, healthcare, and public health professionals. So in 2021, to support the NLM's strategic plan, they funded the NNLM National Center for Data Services, NCDS, to coordinate data-related and data literacy offerings across the NNLM's 7 regional medical libraries and various offices and centers. In fulfilling their mission to provide training and resources to increase data science capacity among information professionals. NCDS hosts one short course each year focusing on a particular data topic. In its first year, NCDS hosted a short course on ethical considerations of data, with topics such as ethics in data collection, ethical data communication, and ethical issues around technology and data use in libraries. For this year's short course, we drew on NCDS's core values, including diversity, accessibility, and inclusivity, and how these issues intersect with data literacy and access to research. So we began planning this class in the summer of 2022. We first met and chose this topic and began identifying speakers and drafting objectives for the course. Over the next several months, we met with each of the guest instructors that we had recruited to develop and finalize objectives for each of the sessions and for the course overall. And I will share those overall course objectives on the next slide. And this class was scheduled and took place this past April. So for our short course, we had 4 course objectives for students who completed this course to be able to apply accessible and inclusive practices when using health data in a library setting, to advise researchers on inclusivity and data-based research, to be able to discuss challenges and opportunities for making data accessible to all individuals, and lastly, to apply basic principles of accessibility in data use and reporting. For each of our sessions, we also designed and built out activities with the instructors. We used breakout rooms as well as Padlet to host discussions and collect students' notes and comments. One of our sessions featured a live screen reader demonstration, specifically navigating through a few different web pages using the screen reader. And in particular, a page with an embedded data table. This activity really showcased what interacting with a digital data table is like for someone using a screen reader, and how important it is to properly label columns and rows in order to make a table navigable. Another example of one of our activities was for our session on data reporting and visualization. The instructor provided 5 examples of data visualizations that could be improved to be made more accessible. And students met in their breakout rooms and wrote their suggestions and comments for how to improve the accessibility of their visualizations in the Padlet. So our course was structured and planned to be 4 1.5-hour long live sessions hosted via Zoom, focusing on these topics: global scale data inclusivity, inclusive data governance, digital and data accessibility, and accessible data reporting and visualization. Unfortunately, our first session on global data inclusivity was canceled, but we were planning to cover learning objectives such as defining data inclusivity and identifying challenges and strategies used at a global scale throughout the research data lifecycle. Our second session, which was actually our first section, was on inclusive data governance, focused on Indigenous data sovereignty, with learning objectives to identify the core components of the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance and what responsibilities or actions can be taken to apply these principles. The next session focused more on accessibility, particularly looking at the 4 core principles of WCAG and digital accessibility standards, as well as providing examples of compliance versus best practice when it comes to digital accessibility. Our final session looked at what accessibility means for creating data visualizations and how to apply accessibility best practices, such as when choosing color palettes, writing chart titles and labels, and creating alt text. So as far as the content of the course, we summarized 5 key takeaway points. First, we learned about the CARE principles for working with Indigenous data and communities, their collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And we talked about how these principles intersect and expand upon the FAIR principles of data management and sharing. 2, use plain language whenever possible in web pages, in chart titles, and alternative text. Be concise and make sure alt text is descriptive as well as easy to understand. 3, user testing can improve accessibility. There are several web tools available to test accessibility of websites or visualizations, but, such as color contrast checkers and color blindness simulators. But involving users directly and user testing is also a great way to involve members of the disability community in making research and research data accessible and inclusive. 4, from the beginning, and it's funny, we heard about this morning, accessibility should not be an afterthought, that from the beginning, designing projects with accessibility in mind and incorporating accessibility into workflows. And one of the examples of being, consider using or developing a template or a style guide that already has fonts, colors, layouts that have been tested for accessibility. And lastly, a recurrent theme that we have heard already today and that sits at the heart of inclusivity and accessibility in research is nothing about us without us. And now I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth.
So since wrapping up the class last month, we've had time to review student and instructor feedback as well as reflect on the challenges that arose during planning and implementation. So some of the challenges that we faced were the general coordination of speakers taking a large amount of time. We also wanted to make sure all 4 sessions were cohesive. We met regularly with them and together as planners to build out learning objectives and activities. And then additionally, we had huge demand for the class. So managing that demand, which I'll talk about in a later slide, as well as ensuring that it was accessible on our end, making sure we are practicing what we preach and actually having accessible elements to this class. So looking at the demand, we originally had capped the class registration. We have a registration system through NNLM's website that has a client relationship management built in. And so we originally capped the class at 70, thinking, okay, we'll have probably 50 people active. That way it can stay engaging and we can have breakout rooms, et cetera. However, we launched we announced the class through an email that had a very popular response, in that we had over 200 people on the wait list within 2 hours. So we filled the class, and then we had this giant wait list of people. So while we were excited that some people are interested, we were like, we can't meet this demand and maintain interactivity with the activities. In the end, we did have about 55 attendees per session. So we had the 3 sessions. And we did have some people who crashed the class. They weren't on our registration, but they were on the Zoom call. So they got in there and learned some stuff. And in the end, we had 27 people who did attend all 3 classes, which was our intent, but obviously things come up and people can't attend everything. So for evaluating the course, we used a training survey that's standardized, we use for all NNLM trainings. They were asked to complete it at the end of the 3 classes, and we had about 50% response rate. They responded on how they found the course to be engaging, informative, and well-paced, as well as reflecting diversity in the class, in the images in the slides, as well as feeling that the instructor was knowledgeable. We had really great metrics from that, with over 85% of respondents selecting agree or strongly agree for those factors. They're also asked to respond on how useful they thought this course was going to be and what they would do with it afterwards. So they said that we were likely to support users' needs more effectively, sharing skills and resources learned with others, as well as starting to use new resources and tools, and engaging with new audiences. So our assessment instrument also had 3 open-ended questions for participants to elaborate a little bit more on usefulness, areas of improvement, and how they might use it in the future. And so they mentioned in general they enjoyed the breakout rooms and the use of Padlet, and just the general interactive elements of this class. It wasn't just to sit and listen to someone talk about accessibility. You actually got to have hands-on interactive time. The guest instructors were also very happy with how the class went, and they appreciated the engagement and the enthusiasm of the students. We do feel that the class overall was a success, especially in encouraging participants to learn more and begin incorporating accessibility in their work. And while obviously we cannot cover so much of what's involved with accessibility, inclusion, and data, this was a starting point, and 3 hours of, or I guess longer, 4.5 hours of learning with real takeaway elements to implement at the end. So in terms of our takeaways of what we learned, first, determine interest before opening up registrations. We tried to be intentional and equitable with how we even launched the announcements, but we messed up with the time zone, so the West Coast didn't get it in time, so it filled up before anyone in the Pacific time could register. So we had just some while the intention was good, it sort of flopped in our implementation. But we do now have this 200-person wait list of emails that we can say, hey, we're offering this again, or we know you're interested in this topic, we're having this class. Secondly, that things can change at the last minute. Christine mentioned one of our presenters had to cancel really just a few days before the first class. So just realizing it's not gonna, while we planned for probably 9 months, that just went away in a day. So things can change. And finally, that accessibility is a process, not a threshold. Even in a class about accessibility, we struggled with being able to share our guest instructors' slides because some of them were not accessible. So fortunately, we recorded and we had a live captioner, so we could share out the recordings later with the transcript, but there's more work to be done. And given the high demand for this class, we hope to provide an online self-paced version of this class with fully accessible materials in the future. So finally, we wanted to pay acknowledgement to our wonderful guest instructors who are pictured here, as well as the National Training Office who helped with instructional design and technical support, some of our volunteer breakout room facilitators, and then of course the students who came and learned in the course. And so if you have any questions about the class, feel free to contact us. Or if you'd like to learn more about NNLM, just a quick plug that we provide free trainings and have a data focus area. So please become a member and get involved with us. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine and Elizabeth. Let's see if I can find this now. Okay, so next up, now we're going to move over to Canada. So we're going to be talking about Indigenous data matters, finding data for First Nations, Inuk, and is it Metis or Metis? Metis, people in Canada. And so we have with us Alexandra Cooper from Queen's University and Kevin Manuel from Toronto Metropolitan. So Alex is the Data Services Coordinator at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario. She provides data and research data management support to researchers and students for about 2 decades. She has degrees in religion and culture and Canadian history. Kevin, in addition to being the co-chair for this conference for the program, he's data librarian at Toronto Metropolitan University. He's a member of the IASSIST Anti-Racism Resources Interest Group, which just got rechristened the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Group. And as I mentioned, he's the program co-chair. So I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thank you, Bob Ray. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm not going to need to repeat this since Bob Ray did such a good job introducing us. But I would like to start with land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge with debt and gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who were here before us, and recognize as guests that we respect and honor the relationship and relationship and knowledge, or knowledge and relationship Indigenous peoples have on this land. And neither Alex and I are Indigenous peoples, but we think it's important that as data experts, we start this conversation about Indigenous peoples and data. So our presentation today will provide a historical context. So colonization, residential schools, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Then we'll talk about how that led to our guide on racialized and Indigenous peoples. And then we'll discuss more information about finding the data. So with the Census of Canada, but then also talking about Indigenous sources. So where they're collecting data themselves and some of the principles that are around these from the UN, CARE, etc. And I just would like to put a note that due to the nature of some of the historical context, certain terminology and images may be problematic. So to place colonialism in context, we can see the map here of Turtle Island, or North America, looked like before colonization. And it is a process where there's the political, economic, and social domination of one society, and that the colonized are marginalized, disrupted, or eliminated by the colonizer, and colonialism reinforces possession and ideologies of cultural superiority of the colonizer. And so within the Canadian context, if we go back before colonial contact, it was estimated there were about 500,000 Indigenous peoples in Canada at that time. But the first contact was in the 1500s by Europeans, and then in the 1600s there was colonization by France and Britain. And after the 7 Years' War in 1759, New France became part of British North America. And from there were several British colonies that were established across British North America, and these started to confederate in 1867. This map is from 1870, so it looked very different than it does today, and others joined over time. So part of the process of colonialism was the establishment of residential schools, and these were government-sponsored, and they were established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. These were often run by Christian churches, and they began to be established in the 1800s and operated until 1996. And of course, residential schools seriously disrupted the lives and communities, so loss of language, loss of cultural traditions amongst Indigenous peoples. And so I asked Statistics Canada, I said, do you have information on how many children were in residential schools? And the response was, it's unclear precisely how residential schools were enumerated over their long history. And the image here shows a residential school, and the shoes mark the unmarked graves of children that have been discovered in the last few years. So, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started in 2006 and completed in 2015. It cost $72 million. And it was information collected from over 6,500 witnesses from across Canada. So there were 7 national events, and these were to educate, engage Canadians about the social history and legacy of the residential schools, and to share and honor the experiences of the former students and families. So within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there are 94 calls of action, and these are meant to aid the healing process in 2 ways. First, by acknowledging the horrific history of residential school system and creating systems to repeat these abuses from ever happening again. And one important recommendation in that is for museums and libraries to engage in education and sharing information about residential schools. So that ties us to the data. So where are Indigenous peoples represented within the data in Canada? So of course there's the census of population, which currently is conducted every 5 years. But over the history of the census, the terminology has changed dramatically over time. So at the moment, there are questions about ethnicity, visible minority, which is now being referred to as racialized, and Indigenous identity. So Indigenous identity in the current census is separate from other ethno-racial variables. But there have been questions over time about how the variables have been labeled and represented, and I'll talk a little bit about how Statistics Canada has responded to that. So, if we go back in time to 1665, that was the first census done in New France, but as far as we understand, Indigenous peoples were not included in this. And then various censuses were collected by different British colonies over that time, and they were all different based on each colony. And the first census of Canada after Confederation was in 1871. But the early censuses, they varied, and some asked about racial or ethnic or place of birth, and it just depended on the year of the census. So that was conducted every 10 years until 1951, and since 1951, it's been conducted every 5 years, with the most recent in 2021. So I've just included an excerpt here. So we published an article about the work that we've done in creating the guide on Indigenous and racialized peoples. So that was published December in a special anti-racism issue of the IASSIST Quarterly, so please check that out. But I'll just read this right now. So throughout its history, the census has continued to evolve and change reflecting Canada's political and social transformations. However, the census can also be perceived as an instrument of colonialism by deliberately excluding, categorizing, and diluting the existence of Indigenous and racialized peoples. The legacy of colonialism has created mistrust between Indigenous communities and the various levels of government in Canada, especially at the federal level, which administers its relations with Indigenous peoples through the Indian Act and other pieces of legislation. So, Indigenous peoples today, so that's probably about 5% of the population, and the terminology has changed a lot over the time. So historically, the term used was Indian, and then, or Native Indian up till 1981, and then between 1986 and 2016, the term Aboriginal was used, and a big change now in 2021 is the term Indigenous has now been applied. And it's worth understanding that some Indigenous communities don't participate in the census, as they do not permit the government enumerators within their communities, and instead they collect the data on their own. So here's the screenshot of the guide that we created on racialized and Indigenous populations in Canada. So this is an open source tool. It's been the inspiration for the IASSIST anti-racism guide as well too. So if you have time, please take a look at that. And it was a project that happened between 2021, great pandemic project. We were all in a lot of Zoom meetings, but it was for professional, data professionals from across Ontario, and it was, you know, in part our response as an action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and a response to other social injustices happening at that time. So I just want to put this in context. I think this really touches on what Kirsten was talking about as well today, is that you know, we collect data and we understand data in a certain way from a Western viewpoint, but data can mean different things in different worldviews, and how the Indigenous people collect their data and protect their data and have data sovereignty can be very different. And this image really helps to illustrate that there. So it's important to reflect when we're working with data that there's different worldviews and how that's collected and shared. So with that, that turns over to Alex, who will share information about data sources from Indigenous peoples.
Thanks, Kevin. So yeah, we're going to now talk about data sources from Indigenous peoples. So the First Nations Information Governance Center is an independent, apolitical, nonprofit organization that provides research, training, capacity building, and knowledge translation for First Nations data. And it was created in 1996 with the goal of creating a First Nations health survey. And this was in response to the federal government announcing that they decided to exclude First Nations peoples from 3 major longitudinal surveys. So they've basically taken it upon themselves to create this survey, so they have that data. Since then, FNGIC has continued to run their own data surveys, and they've run surveys on health, education, employment, and community. And these are conducted on reserves and in Northern First Nations communities, which tend to be not as well surveyed by the Canadian government. So one of the part of the work, and one of the major things that the FNGIC has done, is create this First Nations principles of OCAP. And this was created initially in 1998, and the principles were created to ensure that the First Nations own and are stewards of their data. It also reflects their commitment to the use and sharing of information to benefit the communities and to minimize harm in survey collection and in data collection. So these are principles that when someone, whether they're First Nations people doing First Nations surveying or research, or people outside of the First Nations surveying or researching First Nations, they need to follow to respect First Nations beliefs and minimize harm. So the OCAP principles stand for ownership, meaning it reflects the relationship of the First Nations to their cultural knowledge, data, and information. Control, which is how determines how the data is used, by whom, and under what conditions. Access, which is the right to make and manage decisions about access to First Nations' own data. And finally, possession, which refers again to the stewardship and using of information that will benefit First Nations communities. So internationally, we have similar, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the General Assembly in September 2007. And it aims to change the lens of how governments interact with Indigenous peoples. It establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples around the world, and elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply to specific situations of Indigenous peoples. Now, Canada didn't initially sign the declaration. They didn't sign it till 2010. Actually, they didn't sign the declaration in 2010. They announced support of it. There was a lot of questions about how supporting this would interact with federal laws. However, in 2021, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act came into force. And this act is requiring the government to work with Indigenous peoples in Canada to co-develop an action plan to address the objectives of the declaration and to ensure that the federal laws are consistent within it. So really bringing it into Canada and making sure that Indigenous people are reflected in Canadian laws properly. And the action plan is actually expected to be released this summer, although I looked it up the other day and it was kind of like, it's supposed to be done this summer, but it may not be. So hopefully sometime this year, early next year, we'll be seeing that. So very similar to the principles of OCAP are the CARE principles, which were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And the CARE principles, very similar to the OCAP principles, they promote Indigenous control over their data. The primary goal is to foster Indigenous self-determination by enhancing Indigenous use of data for Indigenous pursuits, and data share in un-Indigenous terms. So CARE stands for the collective benefit that all Indigenous people must benefit from their data or data about them. Authority to control, that Indigenous people's rights, interests, and authority must be recognized and respected. Responsibility ensures accountability, requiring meaningful and open evidence of how data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And ethics, which is the primary concern in research about Indigenous people, is the support of their self-determination and well-being, so that everything done is for them, to benefit them, and again, reduce harm. I've added links here, excuse me, to the overview of the CARE principles and an article from CODATA about this, and it's awesome PowerPoints explaining the CARE principles in great detail, but also the screenshot is just from one of the PowerPoints that just does sort of a really quick overview. Very useful. And, oops, sorry, forgot to print my notes, they're on my phone. Yeah, and as I just said, there is a, oops, I've gone too far. So next, actually, I'm going to go back to the CARE principles. One thing I forgot to mention is that when they developed these CARE principles, they developed them in conjunction with FAIR, so that when Indigenous data is developed and when they're researching it, it's not only following the CARE principles, but it's also following FAIR, findable, accessible, interruptible, and reusable. We have way too many acronyms in data. So moving forward, We have the the IASSIST anti-racism resources, which has been developed by the IASSIST anti-racism group, which I'm also a member of. And so we have links there to the webpage. And there's also a guide that provides help in finding data about racism and ethnic bias. We've developed a Zotero library with research on racism and essays about the national perspectives on collecting data on race in Canada, the US, the UK, and Germany. And the stuff about Germany is really, really interesting. I'm a census geek, so I found it really, really interesting. And then, finally, so just in general, talking about supporting research with Indigenous data, when providing support for that, it's important to consider historical context, such as how variable names have changed over time, and the sovereignty and ownership of the Indigenous data. Also, emphasizing the use of critical thinking and encouraging the hiring of Indigenous library staff and scholars to really better support research with Indigenous data. And that's everything. Thanks. And this is a link to the article that Kevin mentioned earlier. Thanks.
All right, so our fourth speaker is in Nigeria, and she's really in Nigeria. And she was online, but she may have lost connection. Let me just check my email. Okay, of course, I have a zillion messages, mainly from work. Okay. So Ophira is going to watch out to see if she's able to come. And, but if not, the slides and so forth will be provided. She was going to be talking about ageism, and this is another one of the DEI things that we really don't talk much about, but I think we need to talk about more. And we do have some very young people in the room, but a lot of us are getting up there where ageism really matters. But I guess that ageism is also on the other side. Just the comment that I just made, we have some very young people in the room. That's ageism. So. Okay, so what I'm going to do is Ophira is going to be watching out. Hopefully our final speaker is able to come, but we're going to go to Q&A, and I'm going to actually start out with, were there any Q&As in the room online? No. All right, so I'm going to ask that, where's my mic, my second mic? Right here on the projector. All right, so I'm going to draft Kevin. Earlier, very well. All right, so what questions do you have for any of our panelists? And you will speak into the mic. And if you don't have, I have about 5 questions just on the last presentation, much less others.
All right, hello, I'm Alicia Lickmore. I have a very specific question for Sophia and Jen that I had and I wrote down so I didn't forget. I loved that you were keeping track of the data on your consults. Are you tracking the per submission or the per labor? So if someone does a consult and a review, is that 2 or is that 1? Yeah, you have the microphone.
I kind of knew I was going to get this question from data people. I was like, I maybe should have said this to begin with, but so it is not, it would count as 2. So if somebody came and did a synchronous consult with me, and then they sent me their data management plan, which did happen a lot with this first submission, and then they sent me a follow-up question, that would count as 3. I do want to parse the data a little bit more to look at like unique people, right? Like how many actual researchers did we serve versus how many consults did we do? And I should acknowledge that this first data wrangling and these first numbers were generated by our Office of Scientific Integrity. So I didn't do that first data wrangling, but we are continuing to generate this like kind of longitudinal data set, and I'm gonna be really interested to kind of see how else we can parse some of those numbers going forward. Other questions for other people?
Oh, we had my hand runner here.
Also a question for Sophia, sorry. So you mentioned possible monetization or ideas of that. Could you explain that a little bit more, give examples of what people have talked about or what you think they might do? And this is in reference to the NIH policy and like you said, allowable costs. Does that mean like they'll build into the grant to pay for data services or?
I was kind of like purposely vague on that part, but yeah, I'm not sure. I know that researchers are coming to us sometimes and saying, oh, could we write you into our grant? And right now we're like, no, our services are free. I think there might be opportunities that we're looking into around like charging for larger data sets, like if we could think about how we charge for storage costs, but there's some complications there as well as far as we like use local infrastructure right now. So we're trying to figure out maybe, you know, with larger data sets, could we charge? We also have before, you know, been like written into grant budgets for a certain percentage of our time, but I think we're trying to be very careful about not doing that too much right now because I think we could become overwhelmed very quickly if all of a sudden we told researchers, oh yeah, you can write us in for 5% in your grant and we'll do data curation for you. So instead we're trying to say we provide a base level of curation if your data is going into our local institutional repository. We do provide letters of support for some researchers that need that, like the V Foundation's very common. But again, we say, we're not charging you for this. This is kind of the free level that you can get. But I do foresee, and we've already heard within our institution, more conversations around, you know, administrators wanting to be able to figure out how to recoup some of these institutional costs from grants. Some of that might be above my pay grade to decide exactly what happens there.
An additional point to add to that too is it gets a little bit slippery there if we were to start charging people who have grants, but what about people who don't have grants? We're covered by FNA, so we can't really also double charge for things. So we basically so far have thought about, you know, if we do change our storage infrastructure for our repository where it can be a fee for larger data, that's probably the most straightforward way to charge for things, because I think that if we start to become a fee for hire kind of operation, I think also we'd be miserable, because that's just, I've been on soft money. Soft money, frankly, sucks. So I'd like to keep doing what I'm doing, how I'm doing it. So, and we have shared that, so we'll see what happens.
So our speaker is having some connectivity issues. She's corresponding with one of her, is she now in? Okay, she's allegedly in, even though we don't see her. Ophira, what was the question in the room? And we'll ask this one, and then.
So there's a question about, from Megan O'Donnell, a question about the data literacy course. Are there any plans to publish or share the curriculum?
We did touch on that a little bit at the end. We are hoping to be able to, we use Moodle as our learning management system. We have several on-demand classes already that exist on that platform. So we are hoping to take the materials and be able to share them through that platform, and also try to build in the activities, because since that was something that students appreciated so much, the interactive elements, to build activities in that platform as well. And we do want to make the slides accessible. It's just, it is very time consuming. So it's something we're still working on. or we're going to be working on. Yep.
We may not have our final speaker because she's trying to get in, but we're not seeing. But Jackie, in the meanwhile, has a question.
Thank you, Barbara. I also have a question for, is it Christine and Elizabeth? Yeah, so as you know, I was talking about accessibility this morning, so I was really pleased to see your presentation. And you talked about accessibility as a process. And I wondered what your advice would be for everybody in the room, you know, your top tip, if you like, to take away from your presentation. If there was one thing everybody could do differently or better, what would it be?
Well, we discussed after the panel this morning, we were so inspired what the three of you shared, and thought, wow, I mean, it was in a way sort of bold to try to touch on data inclusion and accessibility as this giant theme in 4 classes that were only an hour and a half long. However, the other option is to do nothing. So we really appreciated that that was something that was shared by you all this morning. And we would agree that, you know what, we scratched the surface, we had people start thinking about this, seeing the practical applications, even just the use of alt text on an infographic. That's not something people have maybe thought about. So getting just an awareness out there that hadn't existed, and just to see the interest where we had this huge wait list is that people are curious. People want to make their data and their data process more accessible and be more inclusive, but may not know how to begin. So I think it's just starting and doing something and looking into who the experts are out there. And we didn't talk about what we did pay our teachers. So just getting going on something and then getting feedback and making changes from that.
Yeah, I guess if I would share one thing, I had one and then I thought of another one, so I might actually share 2. But the first one was actually that the screen reader demonstration, just trying to navigate with a screen reader was really fascinating, and realizing how much, how repetitive it can be when on a web page. The second one is the one from our last session on data visualization, and I just love this one because I never thought of it myself. I never thought of it. Was when you're doing a line graph or a bar graph, using different symbols, not just different colors, because well, some people can't tell different colors, and just another way to break up to designate that. So those would be my little tips. Yeah.
I have a presentation and her talk, and I could, but I do actually have a
I have a question for Alex and Kevin. So at the very end of your presentation, you were talking about things you can do and hiring Indigenous people as library staff. And I was wondering how that would sort of work out, just in general to hire more inclusively, or to hire them more specifically in regards to data services. And in part of the fireside chat, the discussion was a little bit about representing so that there's not representing for others, as allies, so that people aren't feeling overburdened as their own populations representing. And so how might hiring Indigenous peoples as library staff potentially be a useful way of supporting finding Indigenous data?
So that's a very good question. My library right now is actually hiring an Indigenous scholarship position. So this is where we're hoping that somebody with Indigenous knowledge can come and teach us about engagement with Indigenous communities, bring their knowledge and experience. And so that's from data to information literacy to research, right? And, you know, beyond trying to hire somebody, just trying to be engaged with Indigenous communities. So how we invited our speaker to the reception yesterday, the last image in our presentation there, I've had the real privilege of being able to be involved with outreach from our library with Indigenous communities. So we're helping a small Indigenous archive digitize their collection. They don't have the resources to do this. They barely have internet. So, you know, for us to be able to collaborate, you know, it's about partnerships, and it's about sharing the resources that we have and engaging, but it's asking permission first. And, you know, we don't want to seem that we're imposing and saying, oh, we've got this and we can help you with that. It's that these relationships are often built with the existing Indigenous groups on campus, and then seeing where the needs are from there.
What I would add to that is at our university, it has made steps forward in hiring more Indigenous scholars, and I believe there's a Canada Chair in Indigenous Research, which is a Canada Chair is federally funded money to have someone be in a particular topic kind of thing. But sort of more in the provincially and national area, the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, which is a fairly new organization that is bringing together advanced research computing, research software, and RDM all together. They, in various different ways, are creating those collaborations and partnerships with Indigenous stakeholders. So with the FNGIC, with other provincial Indigenous stakeholders, so that we can learn and be able to take that information to our university and work with our researchers. I, myself, and Megan Goodchild, who is also here in our RDM librarian, we've been meeting with a researcher who does a lot of working with Indigenous partners, and we're just starting the conversation within this one researcher's, the research she's doing, where we're going to start a conversation about how, when she does her research, how can we get that into a repository to be shared to meet the CARE principles and the principles of OCAP and stuff like that. So it's going to be a very long process, but as Kevin says, it's about the conversations and the collaborations, and yeah.
All right, apologies for all the tech difficulties while we still have her and before we lose another connection. My guy in the back, my friend, is going to switch over, and we will not have time for Q&A after, but luckily we got Q&A in, and so I'm going to skip intros, but you can see the title. I'm sure she will mention a thing about herself. Do I need to do anything in the front? Nope. All right. Ophira, could you ask if she's muted or? Yes. Okay, I do need to leave her slides. Yes. We are. Let's see. Let me come back to you. Okay. Okay, thank you.
describing or discovering the term ageism. This has been around for centuries, and it is a kind of bias that is not noticed by all. It is a more pervasive bias. It is a multifaceted social phenomenon, and it is the only prejudice which will eventually affect every one of us in one way or the other. And that is because we tend to grow and will actually get to a stage where ageism will catch up with us. Ageism, by this definition, can be described as stereotyping, or how people think, the prejudice that people have about others, the discrimination, which means that the action of people towards one another based on age. And this is according to Officer Footer 2018, as it was described in their write-up. So autism is all about thoughts, it's all about feeling, it's all about action. It's all about action that people express towards others based on age factor. Now, what are the measures of ageism? What are the measures of ageism? How do we measure ageism? We measure it when we see the kind of measures and social exclusion based on age. We also see the kind of reduced self-esteem in people that are aged. And most times when we talk about ageism, it's always affecting people that are older, that is older population. And it is also a denial of opportunity or a way of marginalizing this set of people from other category, other people in the population. It is a kind of injustice on their part and a lack of solidarity for them. So based on age categorization, we have some of these measures that can actually tell about ageism. So I would like to talk about the perspective, the technology perspective of ageism. Ageism from the perspective of technology. Now, technology is to fuel knowledge and development in different application areas, and it's a way of giving an improvement to whatever we do. Technology is a skill that is for everyday life, and almost everything we do at this present age tends to be powered by technology. Ageism in technology is more specific, and it concentrates more on younger age rather than the older population, which are the older adults. So most of the time when we talk about technology, we try to refer to technology based or group them for people of younger age. Technology is based on 3 levels, and the levels are macro level, the meso level, and the micro level. For the macro level, we look at ageism based on how technology, design, and policy affects older generation or older adults. And for meso level, we look at how discrimination from technology usage, how it affects people based on their social and organizational environments. And when it is on the micro level of ageism in technology is a personal ageism that is a kind of discrimination that individuals have for themselves. The idea, the attitude, the belief, and the practice that have stereotyped their stereotypical assumption of technology. So we look at the 3 levels, and then we'll come back to hello.
Still hear you.
All right, I can hear you. So we look at the 3 levels of technology. This is macro level, meso level, and micro. So that I'm able to explain or express the way in which people.
You're fading out, and I'm not sure if you're tapping or what, or if it's on our end, but there's a lot of noise, so it's really difficult to understand. We had a brief moment, about 3 sentences that were perfect, but then the noise started again. So let's keep going, but hopefully the noise will disappear.
All right, I think the noise is off now. So I continue by talking about ageism and the digital technology. And we can see that in recent decades, digital technology is rapidly improving. And at the pace of this industrial revolution, we realize that younger population are more beneficial to the development that we have when it comes to technology. Whereas technology in different application areas gives way to improvements, which will not even exclude the older adults. But everyday life and activity is now hinged on the use of technology, either by the use of communication or services, or even the assistive technology devices. These are the ways in which technology needs to affect the older adults. So technology and older adults nowadays are most likely to be left out in the technology development just because of digital inequality. So what is digital inequality? Digital inequality is the gap that exists in terms of access and use. And most times we discuss access and use, but nowadays in this century, digital inequalities can also be linked to the skill, the purpose of use, and the motivation that is considered when digital platforms are accessed. Digital platforms are more, now in this century, are considered to be creating a lot of discrimination, based on age factor. And this is because older adults and technology, there is a stereotypic idea about older adults and technology in terms of internalizing of this stereotype. Older adults are being affected. Their physical and cognitive impairment also can limit them. The digital literacy, which can be a low digital literacy, can also limit the older adults. Lack of interest is another thing that can also limit the older adults from exploring and making use of the digital technology. Therefore, the major issues surrounding older adults and technology for fairness and inclusiveness can be summed up to be in 2 ways. Number one is the aspect of invisibility of old age as object of discussion. What do I mean by this? That is, age has been used severally in categorizing or characterizing the suitability and usability of technology. So the issue of access and adaptability is more linked to younger adults rather than the older adults. And this makes it the old age or old adults to be invisible when it comes to the issue of technology. Another aspect is that a lack of representation of older adults in technology discourse that can result into algorithm discrimination. Nowadays, when we have the data set the data set that we have is more from the majority population. And so in the issue of big data, whatever we have as data set is coming from the majority. And the majority are more of the younger adults. And this makes representation of older adults in technology discourse to be another issue when it comes to ageism. In summary, ageism is a widespread human rights issue, and almost everyone holds a biased attitude towards older adults. I want to tell you today that every one of us seated, we are in a way biased when it comes to older adults. So the preliminary study carried out revealed that most older adults have less access to digital technology. And this might be due to the fear of using the technology, the fear of making regrettable mistakes, whereas some older adults as well do not attach benefits to using technology. Although even with these factors that foster discrimination, majority of the older adults wants to know, they still want to know, they still want to explore technology in a friendly and non-ambiguous way. And there is a shift in the demographic change, which is evidence in an increasing aging rate around the world. So likewise, the reality of technological revolution development is coming into play. So we call for more research on this issue of ageism and technology more than ever before. And the projection that the issue of gap in digital skill will be minimal as the generation of the Gen Z gets to the age of 60 and above. It is a belief, is an assumption that the digital skill gap will be minimal. So in conclusion, ageism as a bias currently remain under study in digital technology, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence research and the fourth industrial revolution based technology. There is still an exclusion of older adults from technology development, and like I explained earlier, due to marginalization, which causes the inequality in the digital environment. Being old should not be equated to lack of interest in and incapability of using technology. So it is important that making technology to be more accessible and usable will go a long way in improving social inclusion. If possible, if the positive side of technology is utilized, technology can serve as a symbol of honor and authority to combat ageism. Digital technology initiative can also help to promote active and healthy aging and enhance independent living to overcome loneliness and social isolation in later years for this category of people. What are the way forward in order to have social justice? There is need for increase in awareness of what ageism is all about. There is need to understand the action that can be used to combat it, especially in the social setting. And that is the place where the information professional can come in creating the awareness and making sure that people really understand the actions that can actually raise what we call a bias. Another aspect of awareness is to create a general public awareness on the different mechanisms of discrimination on digital platforms and the effects of such ageism work in the digital society, like carrying out a campaign, intervention sessions in order for people to, and the general public to be well aware of issue of ageism. There is also need for inclusion of older adults in concept of software design, artificial intelligence development and research and researches. Their input matters when it comes to design. Their inputs will actually help in the algorithm, and it will also inform the kind of design that can suit them and that they can work with adequately. Another thing is that there is need for implementation of policies, agendas, regulations that can outlaw unfair discrimination in our society. And more importantly, there is need for an intergenerational contact intervention or educational intervention. That is, the older generation, the younger generation mingling with the older generation in order to know their tastes, in order to know how they feel, in order to be able to include them in the design of technology devices and gadgets. And this will also help when this intervention is in place. It will also help to reduce the issue of ageism. It will also help to reduce the issue of ageism. With this, I would like to say thank you for listening, despite the fact that the network has not been so favorable, but I believe that we've been able to take something from this. Thank you very much.
So a round of applause for all of our speakers. If you have questions for the final speaker today, if you contact me, I will get the questions to her and we'll make sure that she gets. And the rest of our speakers, I believe, are all here for the duration of the conference, so I'm sure they would be happy to talk to you. We have a half-hour break, or 27 minutes, and there's going to be another session, and then I also really, really urge you to stick around for the poster sessions that are at 5 o'clock. I know people want to go back to their rooms and get ready for dinner, but please visit the posters. And thank you all for being a very patient audience in our first tech